What are some of the other important differences in the differences between male and female earnings? You make some very pointed observations about the differences in experience.
Oh, well, for one thing, women of a given age tend to have fewer years of consecutive employment than men of the same age. I mean, the most obvious difference between men and women is that women have babies and men don't. And that's not a small thing, and it's not of small importance, otherwise the human race would die out.
It's one of the rare empirical observations I think is pretty ironclad. It's hard to argue with that one.
Yes, but it's very different from understanding a particular fact and understanding the implications of the fact. Someone pointed out, Newton wasn't the first man who saw an apple fall. He was just the first man who understood the implications of it.
That's a great point. So in the case of women, what I like is that you don't just make that observation that women have different experience patterns. You show that the gaps between male and female earnings are much smaller when women are, quote, more like men in their experience patterns, correct?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, there's really very little income difference today between men and women who are comparable across the whole range of things that matter. For example, education, meaning not only the number of years, but also the fields of specialization, years of consecutive employment, and many women take out some years after they have children before they return full time to the labor force. Well, that has an impact. The choice of fields matters also, because if women know that they're going to have to stay out of the labor force for a few years, then it matters whether you're in an occupation where you can stay out a few years, come back and resume, or you're in an occupation where the occupation itself is changing so profoundly and so fast that when you come back 5 years later, you're at a huge disadvantage where there's been, for example, technological change, or in the law where the laws on taxes or whatever have changed tremendously since the last time you practiced law, and are going to keep on changing. And so now you've got to step in, catch up with everything that happened during those 5 years, and then still keep up with the new changes that are going on. Military technology, computer technology, and so forth. All those things make it rational for women to pick an entirely different mix of occupations than those that men pick.
My wife took time off from work to be at home with our 4 kids, and as they've gotten older, she's starting to get back into the labor force, and she is a math teacher. Mm-hmm. And geometry and algebra haven't changed much
That's right.
in the last 8 to 10 years, although there are fads in how they're taught, I have to say, which she's going to have to reacquaint herself with, I suspect, as she gets more involved. But presumably, women who choose fields that are more dynamic, such as medicine or the technological fields you mentioned, presumably they choose to spend less time out of the labor force when they do have children, or they choose not to have children.
That's right. That's right.
But the point you're making, which I think is the profound one, is that what we observe as something that looks like occupational segregation, which has a pejorative sound to it, need not be pejorative. It could merely be the choices that people make freely.
There's also the question of hours of work as well, and the predictability of the work. As I mentioned in the book, lawyers, for example, if you're an attorney for some major national or international law firm, and there's suddenly a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit springing up at one of the branches, 5,000 miles away, and you're the expert on that field, then you're just going to have to go 5,000 miles away on short notice and stay there until such time as that lawsuit gets settled. If you're an attorney who's defending someone who's about to be executed a week from now, and the judge has allowed you to have a last-ditch meeting in 3 days to say why he should stay the execution. I mean, you can't go home at 5 o'clock and take the kids out playing soccer on a weekend. You've got to start suddenly spending 16 hours a day or whatever putting together the best case you possibly can so that your client doesn't get executed. and those are very tough things to do for a mother who has children. I have some personal experience along these lines, in that I was a single parent between marriages, and the longest period between two of my books occurred during that period. I mean, it was 5 years between books because I had other things to do.
Well, I hope it was a good investment anyway. Although it didn't get you closer to that Hasselblad, I could see that.
No, I'd have a Hasselblad today, except for that.
What about discrimination? A lot of people look at the disparate outcomes for different groups, men and women, blacks and whites, other comparisons, and they conclude it's discrimination. Is there anything to that?
Oh, discrimination is one of a number of factors which can explain differences in a particular case. But of course, the case has to be the analysis has to be for that particular case. You can't just make a blanket assumption that that's what it is. My gosh, one of the things that really annoys me considerably in these black-white comparisons, and sometimes black-white-Hispanic comparisons, is that so often, I would say most of the ones that I've seen, they leave out Asian Americans, even when there are data on Asian Americans, and from wherever they're citing their data on blacks and whites. And if you included the data on Asian Americans, it would really make the case collapse like a house of cards in a lot of cases. For example, there's been a lot of talk about how blacks don't get approved for conventional mortgage loans as often as whites. Blacks have to resort to subprime loans more often than whites. Blacks are more likely to be laid off during a downturn than whites. Now that sounds very persuasive until you throw in the data on Asian Americans. Whites get turned down for conventional loans more often than Asian Americans. Whites have to resort to subprime loans more often than Asian Americans. Whites get it laid off during a downturn more often than Asian Americans. Now, if you took seriously the argument that these racial disparities show discrimination, you would end up with the absurd conclusion that the white employers and the white lenders are all discriminating against white workers and white consumers. But you can't just pick and choose when you're going to consider evidence seriously and when you're not going to consider it seriously.
A lot of people attribute the progress of black Americans and women as well to various anti-discrimination laws. Is that a good idea? Is that true?
Well, it doesn't fit either the history or the economics. If you trace with women the periods in which they were doing well and which they were not doing well, most people are unaware that women in the first couple of decades of the 20th century were doing much better relative to men than they were, say, in the middle of the 20th century. And there's no great mystery as to how that came about. That as women's age of marriage began coming down, and they started having children at earlier and earlier ages, particularly the baby boom being the climax of that, obviously they weren't able to get postgraduate education or college education in many cases, and therefore they were not eligible for the higher level jobs that they'd held in earlier times. So if you compare in a number of fields, including economics, what percentage of the people were women, say, in 1930 as compared to 1950? It was more in 1930.
Interesting.
Law, other fields, but as the age of marriage came down, as they had more children, they declined. Now, the people who argue the other way avoid all that by the simple practice of starting their discussion in the 1960s as if the world were created in the 1960s. And then they show that women rose. Well, actually, women started rising around the middle of the 1950s because the age of marriage started rising again around that time. And you can just plot this on a graph, and you can see the almost mirror images when you compare the age of first marriage and the level of women in professional occupations. And so as women now began to rise by about 1972, and the professional fields, they got back to where they had been in 1932. And then as the age of marriage grows to just unprecedented levels and more women didn't get married at all, then you begin to see women rise in these areas. But it has very little correlation with affirmative action or with anti-discrimination laws.
Why should age of marriage be so important?
Oh, because the age of marriage usually also ties in with the age at which women start having children.
My first thought would be it might be better to have your children young, and then you could have an uninterrupted period of investment in human capital. But is that not the case?
Well, the different women make different decisions on this. But the point is that the marriage age and the childbearing age have a profound effect on them. If you look at those women who would never marry,
that's one effect by
you see that they in the academic world they were doing better than men. Almost 30 years ago.
And what about for the racial differences? A lot of people attribute the progress of Black Americans to Civil Rights Act, other anti-discrimination law, etc.
Well, you can make that case when it comes to elected officials. That after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the number of Black elected officials just skyrocketed. But when you move into other things, incomes and occupations, the percentage of Blacks who were in poverty declined from 87% back in 1940 to 47% in 1960, and that was before there were any civil rights laws of any consequence. The long-term trend of Blacks in poverty was down. It continued through the 60s, but it wasn't accelerated at all. And after about by 1970, it wasn't accelerated even worth talking about. So none of those things really is correlated with how Blacks have either come out of poverty or have risen into professional occupations and so on.
Yeah, I think that flattening of the poverty rate, which had been falling before, really cuts across all groups, and it's overwhelmingly driven by family structure. All groups actually, if you look across all races, poverty rates fall through the 70s and 80s and 90s if you hold family structure constant. So if you only look at a particular kind of family, a two-parent family, it's very low, the poverty rate, but it continues to fall all through those 30 years, 70s, 80s, and 90s. If you look at single women, it continues to fall. If you look at single women with children, it continues to fall. The problem is that the proportion of all families that are single women with kids explodes over that period. And as a result, the overall poverty rate basically stays flat, even though every single type of family is getting less poor. It's it's a paradox statistically for people, but I suspect that's part of what's going on in the Black numbers.
Yes, the figure that struck me in doing the research was that the poverty rate for Black married couples has been in single digits since 1994.
Yeah.
And so the argument that the Black poverty is due to racism really falls apart because the people don't change their race when they get married. And yet, if you look at Blacks in the ghetto with the single mother and all of that, the poverty rate is just huge.
Yeah, that's a big handicap. Any thoughts on why equality is so appealing to human beings? The idea of it, especially the measured equality that we often use to assess the fairness of capitalism, say, or a particular economic system. People look at measured outcomes, as you point out, with all of these flaws where we wouldn't expect equality, and yet they judge it accordingly. Well, any thoughts on why that is?
I think a certain amount of that is artificial in the sense that intellectuals have been terribly preoccupied with this for a very long time. And insofar as they influence through the media and through educational institutions how other people think about it, they keep pushing this thing. Even many of the advocates of equality, I think of R.H. Tawney in the 30s, lamented that the general public didn't seem to be nearly as concerned about this as they are. And so the real question is, why are intellectuals so concerned about this?
Any thoughts on that?
I think that, again, it ties in with their notion that they ought to be deciding what society is like, and the things that they don't understand shouldn't be allowed to remain. It's like the argument about the corporate CEOs. Many intellectuals have said, I don't see why a corporate executive should be making so much money. Well, I don't see why anybody should be making the money they do. I mean, well, why in the world would you imagine that you should be aware of why corporate executives make that kind of money, or why it should be any of your business?
Yeah, I think it was Hayek who said, and I want to come back and ask you about Hayek later, but just as an aside, I think it was Hayek who explained his explanation for why intellectuals were more likely to be socialists than capitalists was a purely self-interested one. You know, for those of us who are in favor of more decentralized decision making rather than centralized decision making, we have this embarrassment that it seems like the people with the high IQ tend to be the communists, the socialists, the so-called social democrats, the people who want more government.
Mm-hmm.
And Hayek's observation was, well, yeah, they'd have more power in those systems, so of course they're in favor of it. So that was a early public choice argument, which I've always found comforting.
Yes, I think it's absolutely true.